The people who deserve your respect the most are often the ones you almost never notice. On a cool Friday evening in downtown Chicago, Bennett House looked exactly the way every successful restaurant hoped to appear. Soft golden lights glowed through tall windows. Fresh flowers decorated every table. The gentle sound of piano music drifted through the dining room, while well-dressed guests laughed over expensive meals and carefully poured glasses of sparkling water. Outside, a steady line of customers stretched along the sidewalk, patiently waiting for their names to be called. It was the busiest dinner service of the week, and every employee moved with practiced precision. Inside the lobby, Rachel Collins stood behind the reservation podium wearing an elegant charcoal suit with a polished name badge clipped neatly to her jacket. At 39 years old, she had built a reputation as one of the strongest restaurant managers in the entire Bennett dining group. She believed every detail mattered. Every smile. Every reservation. Every table. Every guest review. Under her leadership, the restaurant had become one of the highest-rated locations in the city. At least, that was what the numbers suggested. Then the front door opened once again. A quiet elderly man stepped inside, carrying himself with calm confidence that almost nobody noticed. His gray jacket showed years of careful use. His brown leather shoes had been polished many times before. His silver hair rested neatly above kind blue eyes that slowly observed the room without judgment. Harold Bennett smiled gently as though he had all the time in the world. He approached the podium with relaxed steps. "Good evening," he said warmly. "Just one table, please." Rachel glanced up briefly before lowering her eyes toward the reservation screen. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" "No," Harold answered with the same peaceful smile. "I thought I might enjoy dinner here tonight." Rachel typed quickly without looking at him again. "I am sorry. We are fully booked this evening." Harold quietly looked across the dining room. Several empty tables near the windows remained untouched, their candles already lit and waiting. "I understand," he replied politely. "Would you mind if I waited a little while?" Rachel forced a professional smile. "You are welcome to wait, although I cannot promise anything." Harold thanked her sincerely before walking toward a wooden bench beside the entrance. He folded his hands across his lap and watched families arrive together, couples celebrate anniversaries, and old friends embrace after years apart. Every few minutes another party entered without a reservation. Somehow a table became available almost immediately. A businessman wearing an expensive watch received a warm greeting and was seated within moments. A fashionable couple walked in smiling and was escorted directly to a corner booth. Harold simply remained seated, quietly observing everything around him. A young server named Daniel noticed the elderly man waiting alone. Carrying a pitcher of ice water toward another table, he paused beside the bench. "Sir," he said kindly, "would you like a glass of water while you wait?" Harold looked up with genuine appreciation. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." Daniel returned a moment later with a clean glass and fresh ice water. "I hope we can find you a table soon." Harold smiled. "Kindness is never wasted, son. Thank you for remembering me." Daniel returned to work, unaware that Rachel had witnessed the brief conversation from across the lobby. She immediately walked toward him with a quiet, but firm expression. "Daniel," she whispered, "please stay focused on guests who are already dining. We cannot afford unnecessary delays tonight." Daniel nodded respectfully, although he glanced back once toward the elderly man sitting alone by the entrance. Nearly 40 minutes passed. The restaurant remained lively, yet several tables still turned over naturally as parties finished dessert and departed. Harold never complained. He never checked his watch. He simply watched people with patient eyes, occasionally smiling whenever children laughed while leaving the restaurant. Rachel continued greeting new arrivals with polished professionalism, but each time her eyes drifted toward the quiet man on the bench, she chose another reason to postpone speaking with him. None of the guests filling the elegant dining room realized they were witnessing the first quiet chapter of a story that would soon leave an entire restaurant questioning what hospitality truly meant. Harold Bennett remained seated near the entrance as the evening crowd continued flowing through the restaurant with effortless rhythm. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying polished trays filled with carefully prepared meals. Soft conversations blended with quiet laughter while glasses gently touched during celebrations that seemed to unfold at every corner of the dining room. The atmosphere reflected everything guests expected from one of Chicago's finest restaurants. Yet from the wooden bench beside the front door, Harold quietly observed details that most people never noticed. A young couple entered carrying a sleeping toddler wrapped in a small blanket. Before they reached the reception stand, Rachel smiled warmly and immediately asked another employee to prepare a quieter corner table where the child could rest peacefully. Harold appreciated the thoughtful gesture. A few minutes later, an elderly woman using a cane slowly approached the entrance with her daughter. Daniel quickly opened the front door, offered his arm for balance, and helped both women safely inside before wishing them a pleasant evening. Harold smiled softly as he watched the exchange. Kindness still lived here. It simply appeared in unexpected places. Meanwhile, Rachel continued checking reservations with remarkable efficiency. Every available table seemed carefully planned according to arrival times, preferred seating, and guest history. Her professionalism impressed anyone who observed only the surface. But Harold noticed something different. Whenever guests arrived wearing tailored suits, expensive jewelry, or designer clothing, Rachel's smile became slightly brighter. Her voice carried extra warmth. Small exceptions suddenly became possible. Waiting lists became flexible. Reservations somehow appeared where moments earlier none had existed. None of these decisions seemed dramatic on their own. Together they quietly revealed a pattern. Nearly an hour had passed since Harold first entered the restaurant. Daniel approached the reception desk carrying a dessert menu for another guest before speaking gently. Rachel, table 12 has just become available. The reservation cancelled about 15 minutes ago. Perhaps we could seat the gentleman who has been waiting. Rachel briefly looked toward Harold before returning her attention to the computer screen. Keep the table open for walk-in premium guests, she answered quietly. Friday nights usually bring higher spending customers after theater performances. Daniel hesitated only a moment. He has been waiting a long time. Rachel lowered her voice further. Our responsibility is maximizing every seating opportunity. Please trust my judgment. Daniel nodded respectfully and returned to the dining room, although disappointment briefly crossed his face. Harold had overheard none of the conversation, yet he noticed Daniel's expression as the young server walked past. Daniel paused beside the bench once more. Sir, I am sorry for the delay. May I bring you another glass of water? Harold looked up with grateful eyes. You have already shown me more hospitality than you realize. Thank you. Daniel smiled modestly before refreshing the glass with fresh ice water and a slice of lemon. Nearby, one of the restaurant's veteran dishwashers finished carrying clean plates into the kitchen. As he passed the entrance, Harold greeted him with a friendly smile. Busy evening. The older employee laughed warmly. Busier than ever. But that keeps us grateful. Harold nodded. It certainly does. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, yet both men parted smiling. Rachel observed the interaction from across the lobby without commenting. Her attention remained fixed upon reservations, guest requests, and projected revenue for the evening. Numbers had gradually become easier to measure than people. Outside, light rain began falling across the city streets, leaving tiny silver reflections beneath the restaurant's entrance lights. More guests hurried inside carrying umbrellas and laughing about the unexpected weather. Harold quietly stood, walked toward the window, and watched raindrops trace slow paths across the glass before returning to the bench. His patience never weakened. His posture never changed. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned long ago that character is revealed most clearly while waiting. Around him the restaurant continued delivering beautiful meals and polished service, yet an invisible test had already begun, and almost no one inside realized that the true measure of hospitality would never be found on the menu, the reservation list, or the evening's revenue report. It would be discovered in the simple choices people made when they believed one quiet elderly man had nothing important to offer in return. The rain outside gradually became steadier, leaving the restaurant windows covered with tiny silver droplets that softened the glow of the city lights beyond the glass. Inside Bennett House, the dinner rush reached its busiest point of the evening. Every table appeared alive with conversation. Wine glasses reflected the warm lighting. Servers moved gracefully between guests with practiced confidence, balancing polished trays while quietly exchanging courteous smiles. From the wooden bench near the entrance, Harold Bennett continued observing the restaurant with remarkable patience. Nearly 90 minutes had passed since he first walked through the front door, yet there was not a trace of frustration in his face. Instead, his attention drifted naturally toward the people whose work often went unnoticed. A dishwasher emerged briefly from the kitchen carrying a cart filled with clean plates. Harold stood immediately and held the hallway door open until the employee safely passed through. "Thank you, sir," the man said with genuine appreciation. Harold simply smiled. "You have been working hard all evening." The dishwasher laughed softly. "Somebody has to keep the plates coming." Harold nodded. "And everybody depends on you." The employee walked away, wearing a noticeably brighter expression than before. Only a few feet away, Daniel quietly witnessed the exchange while preparing fresh silverware for the next seating. The young server found himself wondering why such a simple conversation felt more meaningful than many compliments he heard from wealthy guests every weekend. Moments later, a food delivery driver entered carrying several boxes of specialty desserts ordered for the restaurant. His jacket was damp from the rain outside, and he struggled slightly while opening the heavy entrance door. Before anyone else reacted, Harold stepped forward without hesitation, holding the door wide open and helping steady the stacked boxes until the driver regained his balance. "I appreciate that," the young man said gratefully. "These become slippery when it rains." Harold smiled kindly. "Everyone deserves a helping hand now and then." The driver thanked him again, before disappearing into the kitchen. Rachel noticed the interaction, while reviewing reservation updates on her tablet. She acknowledged the gesture, only briefly, before returning her attention to the waiting list. To her, efficiency remained the highest priority. Across the dining room another table became available, as guests finished celebrating a birthday. Daniel approached Rachel once more. "Table 9 is ready," he said carefully. "The gentleman waiting by the entrance has been here longer than anyone else." Rachel checked her screen. "A reservation for 4 may arrive at any moment. Leave the table available." Daniel glanced toward the empty dining space. "The reservation is still 30 minutes away." Rachel looked directly at him. "Daniel, please trust the seating plan." He nodded respectfully, although disappointment settled quietly across his face. Harold noticed none of the conversation itself, but he recognized Daniel's sincere effort the moment the young server returned carrying another fresh glass of water. "Still waiting with me?" Harold asked gently. Daniel smiled apologetically. I wish I could do more. Harold accepted the water with gratitude. You already have. Never underestimate simple kindness. Their conversation lasted only seconds before Daniel hurried back toward another table. Nearby, an elderly couple entered the restaurant celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. Rachel welcomed them warmly, because they held a premium reservation arranged weeks earlier. Harold watched as staff members applauded softly while escorting the smiling couple to a beautifully decorated table near the fireplace. He genuinely smiled for them. There was no jealousy in his eyes. Only quiet happiness that someone else's evening had begun well. The contrast, however, became increasingly difficult to ignore. Guests with visible status received immediate attention, while one respectful elderly man remained nearly invisible despite waiting longer than anyone else. None of the decisions appeared cruel on their own. Each one seemed easy to justify. Together they slowly revealed something much deeper than poor customer service. They exposed the unseen values guiding every choice inside the restaurant. Harold rested both hands upon the polished wooden cane leaning beside the bench, and slowly looked around the dining room once more. Beautiful food filled every table. Professional service reached every guest. Elegant music floated through the air. Yet beneath the polished surface, another kind of evaluation had quietly begun. It was measuring neither revenue nor reservations. It was measuring whether hospitality still belonged equally to every person who walked through the front door, regardless of appearance, age, or expectation. The evening moved steadily toward its busiest hour as the rain outside finally began to slow, leaving the sidewalks covered with shimmering reflections beneath the warm glow of streetlights. Inside Bennett House, nearly every seat remained occupied. The kitchen worked with remarkable precision. Servers balanced elegant plates with practiced confidence. Guests toasted anniversaries, birthdays, business successes, and quiet family reunions without realizing another story was quietly unfolding only a few feet from the entrance. Harold Bennett remained seated on the wooden bench with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. More than 2 hours had now passed. He had never complained. He had never asked for special treatment. He had simply waited. Daniel stepped toward the reception podium after delivering another dinner order. His eyes drifted toward an empty table near the center of the dining room where fresh linens had already been arranged for the next guests. Rachel, he said gently, that table has been open for several minutes now. The gentleman by the entrance has been waiting longer than anyone else tonight. Rachel glanced toward the dining room before checking the reservation system once again. That table is reserved. Daniel hesitated. The reservation is not scheduled for another 4 to 5 minutes. Rachel lowered her voice, careful not to attract attention. Friday evenings require flexibility. I prefer to keep our best tables available for guests who regularly choose premium dining experiences. Daniel understood what she meant even though she never said the words directly. He quietly nodded and returned to his section, disappointed but unwilling to challenge his manager further. Harold watched the young server walk away, and recognized the quiet frustration hidden behind his professional smile. Moments later the restaurant doors opened again. 4 elegantly dressed guests entered laughing together, after attending a nearby theater performance. None of them had reservations. Rachel greeted them enthusiastically, before leading them directly toward the very table Daniel had mentioned only moments earlier. Harold observed the scene without changing his expression. He simply watched the group settle comfortably into their seats while menus were placed before them almost immediately. Several guests waiting near the entrance exchanged brief puzzled glances. One middle-aged woman quietly whispered to her husband, "I thought they said everything was full." Harold heard the comment, but remained silent. Daniel noticed it as well. A few minutes later, he approached Harold carrying a fresh pot of hot tea. The rain made the evening colder, he said warmly. I thought you might enjoy this while you wait. Harold looked genuinely touched by the gesture. You continue reminding me that hospitality still exists. Daniel smiled modestly as he poured the tea. Before either man could continue their conversation, Rachel approached them with measured steps. Her expression remained professional, yet noticeably firmer than before. Daniel, she said calmly, your tables need attention. Daniel immediately apologized. Yes, Rachel. He returned toward the dining room, leaving Harold standing beside the small table holding the teapot. Rachel looked politely toward the elderly gentleman. Sir, I appreciate your patience this evening. Harold smiled kindly. You have been very busy. Rachel folded both hands together. Unfortunately, I do not believe we will be able to accommodate you tonight. Harold looked quietly across the dining room where several tables would soon become available as guests finished dessert. I do not mind waiting a little longer, he answered gently. Rachel offered another courteous smile, although this one felt noticeably more distant. I would recommend trying another restaurant this evening. We need to prioritize guests with reservations and our regular premium clientele. For the first time all evening, complete silence settled between them. Harold neither argued nor questioned her decision. He simply looked into Rachel's eyes with calm sincerity. May I ask you one question? Rachel nodded politely. Of course. Harold spoke so softly that only she could hear him. When someone walks through your front door, what do you believe they hope to receive first? A table, or a welcome? Rachel paused for only a brief moment before answering. Our responsibility is to manage the restaurant as efficiently as possible. Harold nodded slowly, as though carefully remembering every word. Thank you for your honesty. He reached for his worn grey jacket, and calmly prepared to leave. Around them the restaurant continued serving beautiful meals beneath warm lights and elegant music, completely unaware that the quiet conversation, beside the entrance, had just become the defining moment of an evening that would soon be remembered by everyone inside the building. Harold Bennett adjusted his grey jacket, with unhurried movements, and thanked Rachel, with the same quiet courtesy he had shown from the moment he entered the restaurant. There was no disappointment in his voice, no visible frustration, only a calm dignity that somehow made the silence around the reception desk feel heavier than before. Daniel watched from across the dining room, wishing he could say something that might change the evening for the elderly gentleman. Before Harold reached the entrance, the restaurant doors opened once again. This time several men and women dressed in tailored business attire stepped inside carrying leather portfolios and travel coats, still damp from the evening rain. Their conversations stopped almost immediately as one silver-haired gentleman looked around the lobby with quiet curiosity. Rachel recognized none of them personally, but their appearance suggested corporate executives or investors. She immediately stepped forward wearing her brightest professional smile. Good evening, she said warmly. Welcome to Bennett House. Do you have a reservation? The gentleman smiled politely. We should. The reservation was arranged through corporate headquarters. Rachel quickly searched the reservation system before finding the booking. Her expression brightened further. Yes, of course. The executive leadership dinner for 8 guests. We have been expecting you. She immediately instructed another employee to prepare the private dining room, personally offering to escort the group inside. Just as the visitors prepared to follow her, one younger executive quietly looked toward the entrance. His eyes suddenly widened with unmistakable surprise. Mr. Bennett, he said instinctively. The lobby became completely still. Harold had already reached the front door and slowly turned around. A gentle smile appeared across his face as he recognized the familiar voice. "Good evening, Michael," he replied warmly. The younger executive hurried across the lobby without hesitation. Instead of offering only a handshake, he greeted Harold with obvious respect and genuine affection. "We have been looking for you all evening," he said. "The board members thought you were already inside." Several members of the visiting group immediately followed him, smiling warmly as they surrounded Harold with quiet admiration. One woman spoke first. "Sir, everyone is waiting upstairs for the quarterly leadership review." Another added, "We were beginning to worry something had delayed your arrival." Rachel remained frozen behind the reception podium. Daniel stopped in the middle of serving a nearby table. Conversations throughout the lobby gradually faded as several guests quietly noticed the unexpected gathering near the entrance. Harold looked kindly toward the executives before answering. "Nothing delayed me," he said softly. "I simply had an opportunity to observe." Michael glanced briefly toward Rachel and then back to Harold, noticing the elderly man still carried the waiting number card he had been given more than 2 hours earlier. His expression changed almost instantly. "Sir," he asked carefully, "were you waiting for a table?" Harold nodded once. "For a little while." Michael looked around the lobby, clearly confused. "You did not receive one?" Harold offered no criticism. "Everyone has been very busy tonight." The simple sentence somehow made the silence even more uncomfortable. Rachel felt her heartbeat quicken as countless details suddenly connected inside her mind. Bennett. Corporate headquarters. Executive leadership dinner. Board members. The elderly gentleman standing quietly beside the entrance was not an ordinary guest at all. Harold Bennett was the founder of Bennett Dining Group, the man whose portrait hung inside the corporate headquarters conference room, photographed years younger, but unmistakably the same person. She had studied that portrait during management training. She had listened to company presentations, quoting his philosophy about hospitality. Yet she had never expected him to appear wearing a weathered gray jacket and polished brown shoes instead of an expensive tailored suit. Michael looked gently toward Rachel. "This is Mr. Harold Bennett," he said respectfully. "Founder of Bennett Dining Group." The words settled over the restaurant like complete silence. Rachel could neither speak nor move. Harold calmly looked around the beautiful dining room once more before resting his eyes on the young server, who had continued offering water, tea, and simple kindness throughout the evening. Daniel stood quietly, unaware that the smallest acts of genuine hospitality had just become the most important service anyone had provided that entire night. No one inside Bennett House seemed able to move. The lively conversations that had filled the restaurant only moments earlier dissolved into complete silence as every eye turned toward Harold Bennett. The warm piano music still floated gently through the dining room, yet it suddenly felt distant beneath the weight of the unexpected revelation. Rachel Collins stood behind the reception podium, her hands resting lightly on its polished surface, as though it had become the only thing keeping her steady. Her carefully practiced confidence disappeared, replaced by quiet disbelief. The elderly gentleman she had asked to leave was not simply an important guest. He was the man whose vision had built every restaurant carrying the Bennett name across the country. Harold noticed the expressions surrounding him and immediately offered the executives a reassuring smile. "Please," he said softly, "there is no reason for anyone to be uncomfortable." His calm voice gently broke the silence. Michael looked toward Rachel before speaking again. "Mr. Bennett, the board has been waiting upstairs for nearly an hour. Everyone believed you were reviewing another location first." Harold nodded kindly. "I was reviewing this location." Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances as the meaning of those words slowly settled over them. Rachel finally found her voice. Mr. Bennet, she began quietly, I had no idea. Harold turned toward her with the same gentle expression he had carried throughout the evening. I know you did not. There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. Only quiet honesty. Rachel lowered her eyes, remembering every conversation they had shared since he entered the restaurant. Every delay. Every polite excuse. Every opportunity she had allowed to pass. Daniel stood nearby holding an empty serving tray, uncertain whether he should remain or quietly step away. Harold noticed him immediately. Daniel, he said warmly. Thank you for the tea. The young server looked surprised. It was my pleasure, sir. Harold smiled. Hospitality begins long before food reaches the table. Daniel nodded respectfully, touched by the simple compliment. Harold then looked around the restaurant once more. Families continued sitting quietly at their tables, unsure whether they should resume their meals. Several employees remained frozen in place. Harold gently raised one hand. Please, he said with a reassuring smile, everyone should continue enjoying their evening. Gradually the restaurant came back to life. Conversations slowly resumed. Servers returned to their guests. Glasses clinked softly once again. Yet something invisible had changed. Every employee now watched Harold with a completely different understanding. Rachel stepped away from the reception podium and approached him carefully. Mr. Bennet, she said sincerely, I owe you an apology. Harold listened without interrupting. I believed I was protecting the restaurant, she continued. Instead, I failed to protect the value this restaurant was built upon. Harold remained silent for several thoughtful seconds before answering. Do you know why I never announced who I was? Rachel slowly shook her head. Because names can open doors that character never has the opportunity to unlock. His words settled gently between them. If I had introduced myself as the founder, every smile tonight would have been easy. Every table would have appeared immediately. But that would have taught me nothing about how an ordinary guest is truly welcomed. Rachel felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from humiliation, but from the realization that she had measured success through reservations, premium guests, and financial performance while overlooking something far more important. Harold continued speaking quietly enough that only those standing nearby could hear. Beautiful restaurants are easy to build. Beautiful cultures require different craftsmanship. He glanced toward Daniel, who had continued serving him with simple kindness despite never expecting anything in return. This evening I experienced both. Michael gently reminded Harold that the board members were still waiting upstairs. Harold nodded. They can wait another few minutes. He looked once more toward Rachel with genuine warmth. I have one request before we begin our meeting. Rachel immediately answered. Anything. Harold smiled kindly. Find one available table. Not because of who I am. Because no guest should ever spend 2 hours wondering whether they are welcome. Rachel quietly nodded. Without saying another word, she personally walked into the dining room, thanked one departing family for their visit, prepared the nearest available table herself, and returned to the entrance. This time, as she invited Harold to take his seat, her smile reflected something entirely different from professional courtesy. For the first time that evening, it reflected genuine hospitality. Harold Bennet accepted the newly prepared table with the same quiet gratitude he would have shown had it been offered the moment he first entered the restaurant. Rachel personally pulled back the chair before stepping aside. The simple gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet every employee who witnessed it understood that something far greater than a seating arrangement had just changed. Harold thanked her warmly before taking his place by the window where soft rain still glistened across the Chicago streets outside. Daniel arrived carrying a menu, but Harold gently closed it with a smile. Before dinner, he said kindly, "Would you join me for a few minutes?" Daniel looked uncertain and glanced toward Rachel. She nodded immediately. "Please do." Daniel took a respectful seat across from Harold while several executives quietly gathered nearby. Rachel remained standing, choosing to listen rather than speak. Harold folded his hands calmly on the table. "Many years ago," he began, "my wife and I opened our first restaurant with only 12 tables. We could not afford expensive decorations. We could not compete with larger dining rooms. The only thing we believed every guest deserved was to feel welcomed before they ever tasted the food." The restaurant around them continued operating, yet countless employees subtly slowed their pace, listening while pretending to continue working. Harold continued speaking in his gentle voice. "Menus change. Buildings become larger. Awards come and go. But hospitality begins during the first 10 seconds after someone opens the front door." He looked toward Daniel. "Tonight you offered water before anyone asked you to. You noticed waiting before you noticed status. That cannot be taught by policy alone. It comes from character." Daniel lowered his eyes modestly. "I only tried to help." Harold smiled. "Exactly." He then turned toward Rachel. She stood quietly with both hands folded before her, no longer carrying the confident posture that had defined her evening. Instead, she looked like someone honestly examining every decision she had made. Harold spoke gently. "Rachel, do you remember the question I asked before I prepared to leave?" She nodded slowly. "You asked what people hope to receive first when they enter a restaurant." Harold smiled. "Have you found your answer?" Rachel took a slow breath before responding. "They hope to know they matter." Harold nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Yes." Silence settled over the table for several thoughtful seconds. No one felt uncomfortable inside that silence. It became a place where reflection could finally replace assumption. Rachel looked directly at Harold. "I spent years believing excellent service meant perfect scheduling, efficient table management, and strong financial results. Those things still matter, but tonight I realized they are only tools. They are not the purpose." Harold listened carefully without interrupting. Somewhere along the way, Rachel continued, "I stopped seeing individual people and started seeing categories of guests. Reservations. Walk-ins. Premium customers. High-spending customers. I convinced myself those labels helped the business. Instead, they slowly changed the way I looked at human beings." Harold's expression remained warm. Recognizing that truth takes courage. Rachel quietly replied, "Living differently will require even more." Harold nodded. "Then begin tomorrow." Michael and the other executives exchanged thoughtful glances. Several had expected a disciplinary meeting. Others had quietly anticipated immediate dismissals or formal investigations. Instead, they witnessed something far more powerful. Harold was rebuilding a culture through conversation rather than fear. He finally addressed everyone gathered nearby. "No one here failed because of one decision tonight. Cultures are built one small choice at a time. They also change one small choice at a time." He slowly looked around the dining room where employees were once again serving meals with renewed awareness. "Every guest who enters this building carries a story you cannot see. Some have wealth. Some have loneliness. Some celebrate. Some quietly grieve. Hospitality asks us to welcome all of them equally." Rachel felt those words settle deeply within her heart. She knew no management seminar had ever taught the lesson she had learned in a single evening. Harold finally opened the menu resting before him and smiled gently toward Daniel. "Now," he said with quiet humor, "after waiting more than 2 hours, I believe I have earned the privilege of ordering dinner." Laughter spread softly across the room, easing every remaining trace of tension. Yet beneath those smiles, every employee understood they had just witnessed a lesson that would remain with them long after the last table had been cleared and the lights had grown dim. The executive meeting scheduled for that evening lasted far longer than anyone had expected, yet very little of the discussion focused on quarterly revenue or expansion plans. Instead, Harold Bennett quietly replayed the events of the evening from beginning to end, not to embarrass anyone, but to understand how small decisions had gradually shaped the culture inside one of the company's flagship restaurants. Rachel Collins remained in the conference room long after the formal meeting ended. She listened more than she spoke, taking handwritten notes instead of relying on presentation slides. For the first time in many years, she realized that leadership could not be measured only through performance reports. It was measured by the atmosphere people created every single day. Harold closed his notebook and looked toward the executives seated around the large wooden table. "Policies matter," he said calmly. "Training matters. Financial discipline matters. But none of those things can replace the way one human being chooses to treat another." No one disagreed. Michael quietly suggested implementing additional hospitality workshops across every Bennett dining group location. Harold smiled politely, but gently shook his head. "Workshops may teach procedures. Character grows through daily habits." The room fell thoughtfully silent. Rachel finally spoke. "Then we must begin changing those habits tomorrow morning." Harold nodded with quiet approval. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." Less than 30 minutes later, Rachel returned downstairs while many employees were finishing the final dinner service. Instead of gathering everyone for a formal lecture, she walked from station to station speaking with each person individually. She thanked the kitchen team for their dedication during busy evenings. She thanked the dishwashers whose work allowed service to continue smoothly. She thanked the hosts, the bussers, the servers, and even the overnight cleaning crew arriving before closing time. Several employees looked surprised because such conversations had never happened before. Daniel noticed the difference immediately. Rachel approached him last. "I owe you an apology," she said sincerely. Daniel looked genuinely confused. "There is no need." Rachel smiled softly. "There is every need. You understood something tonight that I overlooked. You saw a guest before you saw a reservation." Daniel answered quietly. "My grandmother always said that lonely people often enter restaurants hoping for more than food." Rachel reflected on those words for several seconds before responding. "She sounds like a wise woman." During the following weeks, subtle changes began appearing throughout Bennett House. Employees no longer judged guests by appearance before offering a greeting. Every arriving customer received the same warm welcome regardless of clothing, age, or reservation status. Empty tables were managed fairly instead of according to assumptions about spending habits. Managers regularly worked beside frontline employees rather than observing from a distance. Harold quietly visited several locations without announcing himself, sometimes dressed exactly as before, sometimes accompanied by executives, sometimes arriving completely alone. He never came searching for mistakes. He came searching for culture. Each visit revealed steady improvement. Employees greeted delivery drivers with the same respect shown to business executives. Elderly guests were escorted carefully without being rushed. Families with young children were welcomed patiently even during busy evenings. Small acts of kindness gradually became ordinary rather than exceptional. Rachel transformed as well. She no longer evaluated success solely through nightly revenue reports. Every evening before leaving the restaurant, she asked herself one simple question Harold had inspired. Did every guest feel welcome before they were served? Some nights the answer came easily. Other nights it challenged her to improve again the following day. Months later, Harold received a handwritten letter at corporate headquarters. It came from an elderly widow who had recently dined at Bennett House alone after losing her husband. She wrote that although the meal had been delicious, what she remembered most was the host who greeted her by name, the manager who checked on her personally, and the server who never allowed her to feel invisible. Harold quietly folded the letter and smiled. No financial report could measure that kind of success. Looking through his office window across the city skyline, he realized the greatest transformation had never been inside a dining room. It had happened quietly within the hearts of people who had learned that true hospitality begins long before the first order is placed and continues long after the final guest walks through the front door. 1 year passed almost unnoticed, measured not by calendar pages, but by thousands of quiet moments that slowly reshaped the heart of Bennett House. On another cool Friday evening, the restaurant glowed with the same warm lights that had welcomed guests for decades. Fresh flowers rested on every table. Gentle piano music drifted through the dining room. Laughter floated softly beneath the elegant ceiling. From the outside, very little appeared different. Yet anyone who entered through the front door could immediately feel that something invisible had changed. Rachel Collins now stood behind the reception podium with the same professionalism she had always possessed, but her eyes searched for people before they searched for reservations. Every arriving guest received the same genuine smile. Families, business travelers, elderly couples, delivery drivers bringing last-minute supplies, and young servers beginning their first day all received the same simple greeting. Welcome. We are happy you are here. Those words had become more than a polite routine. They had become the foundation of the restaurant's identity. Daniel had grown into one of the dining room supervisors. Younger employees often asked why he always carried a pitcher of water through the waiting area before every dinner service. He never mentioned Harold Bennett by name. He simply smiled and answered, "Sometimes the smallest kindness arrives before the first course." That evening, shortly after sunset, the entrance door opened once again. An elderly gentleman wearing a familiar grey jacket stepped quietly inside, carrying the same polished brown shoes and gentle smile that no longer belonged to a stranger. Harold Bennett paused just inside the doorway, allowing another guest to enter ahead of him before approaching the reception desk. Rachel looked up from the reservation screen. For a brief moment their eyes met. A warm smile immediately crossed her face, not because she recognized the founder of the company, but because she recognized someone she genuinely respected. She stepped from behind the podium instead of remaining behind it. "Good evening," she said warmly. "It is wonderful to see you again." Harold smiled with quiet affection. "Good evening, Rachel." She lightly shook his hand before asking, "Will you be dining alone tonight?" Harold nodded. "If there is room." Rachel laughed softly. "There is always room for every guest to feel welcome." She personally escorted him toward a comfortable table near the window without checking spending history, reservation priority, or any other category that had once guided her decisions. Along the way several employees greeted Harold with genuine warmth, not because he owned the company, but because they had learned to greet every guest exactly the same way. Harold noticed a young hostess kneeling beside an elderly woman to explain the evening menu more clearly. He watched a bussier carefully carry extra cushions for a grandfather, whose back had begun bothering him during dinner. Daniel quietly refilled a lonely widower's coffee without waiting to be asked. None of these moments attracted applause. None appeared in financial reports. Yet together they represented the greatest achievement Bennett Dining Group had experienced in years. After finishing dinner, Harold slowly walked toward the entrance. Rachel met him there before he reached the door. "Thank you for visiting us again," she said sincerely. Harold looked around the dining room one final time. Every table carried conversations, celebrations, reunions, and ordinary evenings made a little brighter by simple kindness. He smiled gently. "A restaurant serves food," he said softly. "A family serves people. Tonight I saw a family." Rachel felt those words remain with her long after Harold stepped outside into the cool evening air. He paused beneath the entrance lights and looked back through the large windows. The building appeared exactly as it had 1 year earlier, yet it had become an entirely different place. Harold quietly adjusted his gray jacket before disappearing into the peaceful city streets, with the same quiet dignity he had carried from the beginning. Inside, another guest entered through the front door, and before anyone asked for a reservation, before anyone noticed clothing, age, or appearance, someone smiled and said, "Welcome." Sometimes the greatest transformations never announce themselves. They simply become the new way ordinary people choose to treat one another.